The words hit me like a slap, sharp and cold, cutting through the fragile calm I'd been clinging to for years. "Go back to the nursing home, Mom." My son's voice was neither loud nor angry, just flat, distant, as if speaking to a stranger, the kind of voice that said when someone has already given up on you. I stood at the doorway, my knuckles still white from gripping the chipped doorframe. The afternoon sun spilled through the half-closed blinds, dust motes drifting lazily in the golden light, but none of it softened the chill that crawled up my spine. For a moment, I wanted to scream, to tell him how many nights I stayed awake, worrying about him, how I'd sewn his school uniforms, baked his favorite cookies, and scraped together every penny to help him buy this house. But my throat tightened, and the words got caught somewhere between my heart and my lips. Instead, I simply nodded, the faintest flicker of defiance tightening my jaw. "I'll go," I said quietly, "but I'm not done yet." He didn't look at me as he turned away, his footsteps heavy on the worn carpet, leaving a silence so thick I could almost reach out and hold it. It wasn't the first time I'd felt invisible in my own son's home, but this time, it was different. This time, I understood what it meant to be discarded, like an old coat left behind in the back of a closet. I moved slowly to the kitchen window, tracing patterns on the fogged glass with a trembling finger. Outside, the world went on without me. Neighbors watering their gardens, children chasing one another down the street, laughter carried on the breeze. I wondered if they saw me the way my son did now, an inconvenient relic, a burden to be shed. The day had begun like any other. I had woken early, made myself a cup of tea, and tried to ignore the growing distance between us. He had barely greeted me that morning, his eyes flicking past me like I was a ghost. At breakfast, I'd attempted to join the conversation, but my words floated unanswered, swallowed by the hum of the television and the clatter of dishes. My son's family was a fortress where I no longer belonged. As I stood there watching the sun tilt toward evening, I thought about the nursing home, the place I'd promised myself I would never enter, the sterile halls, the cold meals, the endless waiting. He'd made it clear he wanted me out of the way, back where he could visit when convenient, then leave me behind again. I swallowed hard, feeling an unexpected surge of anger. Who was he to decide my fate? Who gave him the right to dictate where I belonged? My fingers curled into fists at my sides. I was old. Yes, my hair was streaked with silver, my bones ached more than they used to, but I was not finished, not by a long shot. I turned from the window and walked to the small wooden table where a faded photo album lay open. I touched the yellowed pages reverently, eyes lingering on the black and white snapshots of a life I'd poured into my son. The first day of school, birthday parties, graduations, faces frozen in time, full of hope and love. And somewhere beneath the layers of nostalgia, I found the resolve growing stronger. I would not disappear quietly. That night, I sat alone in my room, the same room I'd lived in since moving in after my husband died. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the soft ticking of the clock, the smell of lavender from the sachet on my dresser. I took out a notebook and pen, my hand steadier than I expected, and began to write. Not a letter, not a plea, a plan. I wrote about the house, the land it sat on, the papers I needed to find, the lawyers I might call. I scribbled ideas for how to reclaim my dignity, how to remind my son that I was still here, and that I had power he'd forgotten to reckon with. The words spilled out slowly, each one a quiet defiance. Because sometimes, when you're pushed to the edge, you find a strength you never knew you had. The next morning, I woke with the notebook on my chest and a clear purpose in my heart. I was going to buy the land beneath his feet. I was going to own a piece of this world he thought he could take from me. And I was going to do it on my own terms. I never imagined I'd end up feeling like a stranger in my own son's house. For decades, I had been the silent backbone of our family. The quiet hands that mended torn clothes, the warm arms that comforted scraped knees, the steady voice that whispered encouragement during hard nights. Raising him was not always easy. There were times when money was tight, when exhaustion crept in like a slow tide, and when doubts gnawed at me in the dark. But I never let him see those moments. I told myself that love was enough, that my sacrifices were the bricks that built his future. I remember the day we bought this house. My husband had passed 2 years earlier, and with trembling hands, I handed my son the down payment I had saved from years of working odd jobs, babysitting, sewing, cleaning houses. I saw the surprise in his eyes, quickly masked by gratitude and smiles. "Mom," he said, "this means everything to us." I smiled back, though inside, a knot of uncertainty tightened. I wondered, had I done the right thing? Was I making a gift or a chain? Over the years, I watched that house fill with laughter, arguments, celebrations, and the endless hum of daily life. I attended birthdays and holidays, tucked their children into bed when exhaustion hit their parents, and helped with every little crisis as if it were my own. I never asked for thanks or recognition. It was simply what mothers did. Yet somewhere along the way, something shifted. I saw the way my son's eyes flicked past me, no longer warm with affection, but flickering with impatience. I felt the subtle changes in tone when I spoke, a slight edge, a dismissive glance. The quiet moments I used to fill with stories and smiles became awkward silences. Invitations to dinners grew less frequent. I wasn't a part of the plans anymore. I was background noise, a shadow slowly fading. One afternoon, I sat with my hands folded in the living room, watching my grandson play on the floor. The house was filled with the scent of fresh paint and new furniture, things I didn't recognize, rooms redesigned with a style that screamed youth and detachment. My son's wife chattered on about weekend getaways and home renovations, barely glancing in my direction. I tried to join the conversation, but my voice was swallowed by the buzz of a phone notification or a loud laugh. That night, I lay awake in the room I'd called home for years. The walls, once comforting, now felt like barriers. I thought about all the times I'd put my own needs aside, all the quiet sacrifices made in the name of love. Was this the price, to be cast aside when I was no longer useful? Tears pricked at my eyes, but I wiped them away fiercely. I was not done, not yet. Memories washed over me, of teaching my son to ride his bike, the scraped knees and triumphant smiles, of his first day at school, the nervous hand in mine as we crossed the street, of late nights spent helping with homework, of the first time he brought home a report card filled with A's. I had been there for it all. I had believed in him, even when the road was rough, and now when I needed him most, he pushed me away. I wondered where it had all gone wrong. Was it the years of silence, the unspoken resentments, the unmet expectations, or simply the slow erosion of closeness as life moved on and I became less central to their world? I thought of my own mother, the woman who raised me with fierce love, who had quietly stepped aside when the family no longer had room. I refused to follow that path. I would carve a new one, no matter how rocky. The next morning, I reached out to an old friend, a woman who had seen more than her share of heartbreak but never lost her spirit. Over the phone, I spoke cautiously, sharing fragments of my pain. She listened without judgment, her voice steady and kind. "You deserve better than being treated like an afterthought," she said. "Maybe it's time to stop waiting for them to see your worth. You have to show them." Her words echoed in my mind. Show them, not through anger or desperation, but through strength, through action. That afternoon, I dug through old files, gathering paperwork and documents I had tucked away over the years. Property deeds, tax statements, receipts, evidence of the years I'd invested, not just emotionally, but financially. My hands trembled as I sifted through the papers, but my resolve hardened. I realized I held a key they had forgotten. The land beneath the house, I discovered, was still in my name. My son owned the structure, but the earth it stood on, the foundation of his life, was mine. A slow smile spread across my face. This was not a threat, it was a promise. I would remind them that a mother's love was not so easily discarded, and that sometimes reclaiming respect meant standing firm. The days after my discovery were quiet, but heavy, like the calm before a storm. I kept my plans close to my chest, filing away the truth about the land beneath my son's house, as if it were a secret weapon. I watched, waited, and took note of the small changes around me, signs I had once missed or brushed aside. Each one was a quiet reminder of how little I belonged. It started with the subtle shifts in tone when I spoke. Conversations that once included my opinion now moved on as if I were invisible. I tried to catch my son's eye during dinners, but he looked through me, focusing instead on his phone or the television. The gentle questions I used to ask about his day were met with monosyllables or silence. My presence was no longer a comfort, it was a nuisance. One evening, as I was clearing the table, I overheard a conversation between my son and his wife in the living room. Their voices were low, but the words carried like arrows. "She's sweet, but it's time she realized this isn't her home anymore," I caught him saying. His voice was calm, almost clinical, but it stung deeper than any raised voice could have. His wife replied sharply, "I've been telling him, we need our space, a nursery won't fit with her here." I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, heart pounding so loudly I thought they might hear it. The phrase "we need our space" echoed in my mind over and over, as if it were a verdict handed down in a court I wasn't allowed to attend. That night, I sat alone in my room, the familiar creaks and shadows pressing in on me. I thought about every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night, every broken dollar given without hesitation. Had it all come to this? Was I truly an obstacle to the family I loved? The next morning, the subtle tension became more tangible. My favorite chair, the one by the window where I'd watch the birds in the backyard, was moved to the corner of the living room. It no longer faced the garden but the wall. When I sat down, I felt isolated, as if the very furniture was conspiring to push me aside. Even the kitchen, once a place of warmth and shared meals, had grown cold. My dishes were replaced with newer, unfamiliar sets. The refrigerator was stocked with foods I didn't recognize, and my favorite snacks slowly disappeared. One afternoon, I decided to fix a cup of tea in the kitchen. As I reached for my usual mug, I noticed it had been tucked to the back of the shelf, replaced with plain generic cups. It was a small thing, but it felt like a deliberate erasure of my presence. The quiet was punctuated by whispers and glances. I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone, telling a friend, "It's like she's still here, but not really. We're trying to be patient, but it's wearing thin." My son's voice followed softly. "She doesn't get it. We need to push her gently, make her feel unwelcome. She'll leave on her own." I swallowed the lump in my throat and wiped my hands on a dish towel, feeling more alone than I had in years. At a family gathering a few days later, the coldness crystallized into an unmistakable divide. Conversations flowed around me, but never to me. My attempts to join were met with polite nods or hurried topic changes. I caught my grandson rolling his eyes when I asked if he wanted to play cards. My granddaughter whispered to her mother and giggled, casting furtive looks in my direction. Later that evening, I sat quietly in the guest room, the walls seeming to close in with every passing hour. I thought about leaving. I thought about what it would mean to walk away, to take my memories and my pain elsewhere. But something held me back, a stubborn flame that refused to be snuffed out. I decided then that if I was to be treated like an outsider, I would not vanish without a fight. The next morning, I received a letter, a formal notice from the Homeowners Association about upcoming renovations. Among the list of planned changes was a nursery conversion of the downstairs den. The letter was addressed to my son but delivered to me. I knew then that the walls were closing in. That evening, I confronted him quietly, hoping to appeal to the son I once knew. "I saw the letter," I said softly, as he sat in his study, papers scattered around him. "You're planning changes without me." He didn't look up. "It's nothing personal, just business." "But it's my home too," I said, trying to steady my voice, "and I deserve to be part of these decisions." He finally met my gaze, eyes cold and tired. "Mom, this isn't about you. It's about our future." I felt the sting of rejection sharpen again, but I held my ground. "I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere unless I choose to." The room went silent, except for the ticking of the clock. Neither of us spoke again that night, but the lines had been drawn. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere grew heavier. Invitations to family dinners stopped coming, phone calls went unanswered. I became a shadow in my own life. Yet, I refused to disappear. I began attending local community meetings, volunteering at the library, and reconnecting with old friends. Each small act was a quiet declaration: I am still here, I am still strong. One afternoon, while sitting in the park, I pulled out my notebook, the one where I'd written my plans. I traced the words with trembling fingers, the path forward still daunting but clear. I would buy that land beneath their feet, not out of spite, but because I deserved to stand tall, to claim what was mine, to remind my son and myself that a mother's love was not so easily discarded. That morning started like any other, but by noon, everything had shifted irreparably. I was quietly washing dishes in the kitchen, the sunlight glinting off the chipped porcelain, when I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door slamming shut. It was a heavy, angry sound, one that shattered the fragile peace I'd tried to hold on to. My son's voice followed, sharp and clipped. "You're not coming in today." I froze, the sponge slipping from my hand and water pooling on the floor. My heart thundered painfully in my chest. The words landed on me like stones, cold and brutal. I turned slowly and saw him standing in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw clenched. His eyes were hard, no trace of the boy who once needed me. "Please, don't do this," I whispered, stepping toward him. He didn't move. Instead, he took a step back and looked at me with thinly veiled disdain. "Mom, you've overstayed your welcome. This is our home now. You belong in the nursing home." I wanted to scream, to tell him how many nights I'd spent comforting him when the world seemed to crumble, how I'd supported him through his failures and his triumphs alike. But all that courage dissolved in the ache of rejection. Instead, I stood there, stunned and silent. The next moments unfolded like a painful blur. My daughter-in-law appeared behind him, eyes cold and lips pressed tightly. She carried a box, moving purposefully toward the living room. Inside were my few belongings, the faded photo albums, the worn quilt I'd brought with me, the small collection of mementos I'd clung to. "You need to pack," she said bluntly. "We've already made arrangements." I swallowed hard, my throat raw. "Arrangements?" I echoed. "What arrangements?" She didn't meet my eyes. "For the nursing home. It's better for everyone." My son nodded in agreement. "We've talked about this. It's time." The room spun. I felt the walls closing in, the weight of years of sacrifice and love crumbling beneath me. "I'm not going anywhere without my say," I said, my voice trembling but steady. He shook his head. "You don't get a say anymore." That day, my world was stripped bare. The home I had known, the family I had nurtured, became foreign and hostile. That evening, I sat alone in the dim light of my bedroom, the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation drifting from the living room where they gathered without me. The silence was deafening. I thought about the promises once whispered in the quiet moments. "You'll always have a home with us." They felt like echoes from another life, impossible to reach. I clutched the worn quilt tighter around my shoulders and let the tears fall, not just for the loss of a place, but for the fracture of trust and love. But beneath the sorrow, a spark of defiance flickered. I wasn't finished, not yet. The next days passed in a haze of uncertainty and pain. My son and daughter-in-law handled the arrangements with clinical efficiency, booking visits with nursing homes and organizing transport without consulting me. I attended meetings but was largely ignored, a ghost in the system. Yet amidst the heartbreak, I found unexpected moments of strength. I reached out to a local advocate for elder rights, a woman named Helen, whose quiet determination reminded me of myself. We spoke at length, and she helped me understand my options, my rights, and the power I still held. "You may feel powerless, but you're not," Helen told me firmly. "You have a voice, and we'll make sure it's heard." Her words became a lifeline. I began gathering every document I could find, medical records, legal papers, letters. I documented every interaction, every slight, every dismissal. I refused to be erased. One afternoon, Helen accompanied me to the nursing home they had chosen. The place was sterile and cold, a far cry from the warmth of my own home. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with faint echoes of loneliness. I walked the halls slowly, taking in the faded paint, the stiff chairs, the distant murmur of televisions. I imagined myself there, a visitor instead of a mother, a guest instead of family. It was not where I belonged. That evening, I returned home to find the front door locked. My son had changed the locks without telling me. I stood outside in the cold, the key I'd held for so long useless in my hand. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. But then I realized something. I still had the land beneath that house. I still had a claim they couldn't deny. And I would use it. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I stood on the cracked sidewalk, staring up at the weathered sign that read County Property Records Office. It was a drab building, nothing like the houses I had once dreamed of owning or the warm family home that now felt so distant. But today, this was the battleground where I would fight for my dignity. With my hand clutching the worn leather strap of my handbag, I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The sterile scent of paper and dust mixed with the low murmur of voices and the rustling of files. I felt the eyes of strangers flicker over me. A small, older woman with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, large gold hoops catching the light, and an expression set with quiet determination. I was here for one reason, to claim what was mine. The clerk looked up from her computer as I approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but brisk. "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I need to access the land records for a property on Maple Street." She nodded and began typing. After a few moments, she pulled out a thin folder, sliding it across the counter. "Here are the details. This property is under 2 names, your son's and another party." I took the folder with trembling hands and began to read. It was exactly as I'd suspected. My son owned the house, but the land beneath it, the very foundation of his life, was still in my name. I felt a flicker of hope spark inside me. Over the next few weeks, I devoted myself to learning everything I could about property laws and rights. I spent hours on the phone with legal advisors, poring over documents, and quietly gathering evidence of my financial contributions over the years. Each page, each signature, was a testament to my silent sacrifices and the home I had helped build. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where so many family meals had been shared, and drafted a letter, not one of anger or accusation, but of intention. A notice that I had begun the process to assume ownership of the land, and that I expected respect, recognition, and fairness. I mailed the letter with a sense of calm resolve. My son's reaction was predictably defensive. When we spoke on the phone, his voice was cold, sharp. "Mom, you're making a mistake. This isn't your fight anymore. Let it go." But I would not. "I'm not fighting to punish you," I said. "I'm fighting for my place in this family, a place of respect, not rejection." The days that followed were a delicate dance of legal meetings, phone calls, and quiet preparation. I found strength in the knowledge that I was reclaiming more than land. I was reclaiming myself. One evening, as twilight settled over the neighborhood, I stood outside the fence that bordered my son's property. The house looked the same, familiar yet unwelcoming. The freshly painted shutters, the manicured lawn, and the porch swing where I once rocked my grandson were now symbols of a family that wanted me erased. I traced the fence line with my eyes, imagining the boundary lines that I was about to redraw. This land, my land, would be a reminder that I was not forgotten, not discarded. Inside the house, laughter floated out the open windows, a cruel contrast to the cold quiet I'd been forced to live with. But I had found my voice. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. We finalized the purchase of the land beneath the house, a quiet transaction that carried the weight of years of pain and perseverance. It was not an act of vengeance, but one of survival. When I called my son to inform him of the change, I expected anger and denial. Instead, I heard hesitation, the catch in a voice that suddenly sounded uncertain. "Mom, this complicates things." I smiled, a slow, steady smile filled with the knowledge that I had taken the first step toward rewriting our story. When the papers finally arrived, neatly printed on crisp white sheets, I held them with a trembling hand. The weight of those pages wasn't just in the ink or the official seals, but in what they represented, the chance to reclaim a part of my life that had been slipping away for too long. This was no small act, it was a quiet revolution. I remember the first meeting with the lawyer. His office smelled of polished wood and old books, a world away from the cold exchanges I'd endured at home. He was a calm man with kind eyes and a careful way of listening. When I laid out the situation, the rejection, the hurt, and finally the hope hidden in that land deed, he nodded thoughtfully. "You have more power than you realize," he said. "Buying the land will change the dynamics. Your son will have to acknowledge you, not just as a mother, but as a landowner. It's a smart move." I took his words to heart. The next weeks became a whirlwind of calls, documents, and decisions. I sifted through financial records, rechecked my savings, and balanced the daunting reality of what this purchase meant. It wasn't simply about ownership, it was about reclaiming respect and establishing boundaries. Throughout it all, I felt a storm of emotions: hope, fear, determination, and moments of loneliness. Late at night, I'd sit by the window, clutching my favorite mug, staring out at the quiet street, wondering how my son would react when he learned I had taken this step. One afternoon, I went to the bank with a folder thick with paperwork. The teller, a young woman with a bright smile, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and respect as I arranged the documents on the counter. "This is quite a project you're working on," she said. I smiled, the defiant spark in my eyes shining through. It's never too late to take control. Back at home, I started drafting letters, formal notices to my son and his wife, informing them of the land purchase. I kept my tone calm but firm, emphasizing my desire for fairness and respect. I refused to let anger dictate my words. This was about standing tall, not tearing down. When I sent the letters, I felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. The die was cast. The family's response was swift and unmistakable. Phone calls came with sharp tones and veiled threats. There were texts filled with frustration and pleas wrapped in manipulation. But I stayed grounded, refusing to be pulled into their drama. "I'm doing this for all of us," I told a close friend during a quiet dinner. "Not to punish or fight, just to remind them and myself that I am still here." Her eyes softened. "You're showing remarkable strength." I nodded. Sometimes, strength is the quietest voice in the room. In the weeks that followed, I began to see subtle changes. The air between us was taut, filled with unspoken words and wary glances. My son avoided direct confrontation but sent messages through his wife, veiled in politeness but edged with frustration. One evening, they came to visit unexpectedly. I greeted them at the door with steady eyes and the same calm I had fought to build inside. "We received your letters," my son said, folding his arms. "I thought you might," I replied. "I hope we can find a way forward that respects all of us." His wife looked at me, eyes narrowed, but lips pressed into a tight line. "This isn't easy for any of us." "No," I agreed, "but it's necessary." That night, after they left, I sat by the window with my notebook. I wrote about the journey, the pain and the growth, the battle between love and boundaries. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of peace. I was no longer invisible. I was a woman reclaiming her story, one quiet step at a time. The day the deed was officially mine, I felt a quiet surge of triumph mixed with something softer, a bittersweet relief that I had reclaimed more than just a piece of earth. As I signed the final papers, the lawyer's office was silent except for the steady scratch of the pen and the distant hum of city life beyond the window. I held the deed in my hand afterward, the weight of the paper heavier than I expected. It was more than legal proof, it was a statement, one that said I refused to be cast aside, that I was no longer powerless to the whims of family neglect. Leaving the office, I wrapped the deed carefully in an envelope and tucked it into my handbag. The sky was a clear blue, sunlight spilling across the pavement like a promise. I felt the warmth on my face and looked up, breathing deeply. For the first time in many months, I allowed myself a smile, small but real. At home, I placed the envelope on the kitchen table where I had spent countless hours planning, hoping, and now, acting. It was a symbol of the line I had drawn. I thought about how my son would react when he found out. The thought brought a mix of apprehension and quiet satisfaction. That evening, I made a simple dinner, roasted chicken and vegetables, and set the table as if I expected company. When my son and daughter-in-law arrived, their greetings were polite but guarded, their eyes wary as if they sensed the shift in the air. "Mom," my son began cautiously, "I hear you've made some changes." His tone was measured but tense. "I have," I replied evenly. "I purchased the land under the house. It was in my name already, but now I've made it official." He blinked, surprise flickering briefly before it hardened into a wary expression. "That complicates things," he said. "Not as much as you might think," I answered, maintaining my calm. His wife's eyes narrowed slightly. "We didn't expect this." "Neither did I said, "but sometimes we have to remind others that respect isn't given, it's earned." The conversation was tense but civil. I could tell they were trying to find footing in a rapidly changing dynamic. For the first time, I saw hesitation in their confidence. Later that night, I sat alone by the window, the deed resting beside me like a shield. I thought about the journey here, the quiet betrayals, the whispered conversations, the cold looks and slammed doors, but also about the strength I'd found in standing firm, in taking control of my narrative. The deed was not just a piece of paper, it was a declaration of my resilience. I had fought for more than land. I had fought for my dignity, my place in the family, and my right to be seen. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. The day the letter arrived, I saw it before I heard the knock, a crisp white envelope with my son's familiar handwriting, neat but somehow unfamiliar now. It lay on the kitchen table, as though dropped there without ceremony, yet it carried the weight of every unspoken word and tension that had filled our fractured home. When I opened it, the words inside were formal, carefully constructed, an expression of shock, disbelief, and thinly veiled accusations. My son wrote that he felt betrayed, that the purchase was unnecessary and hurtful, and that it threatened to tear the family apart. Reading between the lines, I sensed the fear of losing control, the fear of having to face me as an equal rather than an invisible fixture. I sat back in my chair, heart heavy but steady. This was the reaction I had expected. What surprised me was the quiet strength that now steadied my hands and the calm in my mind. I was no longer a frightened woman waiting for approval. I was someone who had made a choice and owned it fully. That evening, they came to the house. My son's presence filled the rooms like a storm cloud, dark, charged, and unpredictable. His wife's eyes were sharp, measuring, waiting for a misstep. Yet, as they stood in the living room, I held my ground, the letter in my hand like a shield. "We didn't want it to come to this," my son began, voice taut but restrained. "Why did you have to make this so difficult?" I met his gaze steadily, because respect isn't given lightly anymore, it's earned through actions and acknowledgement. His wife crossed her arms, skepticism clear in her stance. "We've been trying to make room for you, but you pushed too hard." I shook my head gently. "I only pushed for what's rightfully mine, and what's rightfully my place in this family." The tension between us was palpable. There was no shouting, no tears, only the heavy weight of years of unmet needs and misunderstandings pressing down like a silent verdict. After they left, the house felt different. Not empty, but charged with possibility. I knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. Over the following days, the calls and messages continued, some pleading, some angry, but I did not respond impulsively. Instead, I documented everything, the conversations, the emails, the moments of confrontation and calm alike. I was building a record, not to punish, but to protect myself. One afternoon, I met with Helen again, the advocate who had become my lifeline. She encouraged me, reminding me that this was about dignity and boundaries, not just property. "You're showing them you won't be ignored," she said. "That's powerful." I nodded, feeling a deep swell of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly seen, not just by others but by myself. That evening, I sat in the quiet of my room, looking out at the garden. The flowers I had planted years ago were blooming, bright, stubborn bursts of color against the fading light. I smiled softly. Like those flowers, I would continue to grow, despite the odds, despite the coldness. This was my home, this was my life, and I was here to stay. The moment I decided to share my story publicly was not born from anger or revenge. It was born from a need to reclaim my voice in a world that had tried to silence me. I had spent months buried in paperwork and hushed conversations, navigating the cold waters of family betrayal and legal battles. But at some point, the weight of invisibility became unbearable. I could no longer carry the shame and isolation alone. It began quietly, an article in the local community newsletter about elder rights and family conflicts. I reached out to the editor, a woman named Clara, whose warm voice on the phone was a balm after months of tension. We met at a small cafe on a rainy afternoon, the sound of raindrops tapping softly on the windows like a rhythm for new beginnings. I told Clara my story, how my son had pushed me out, how I fought back by buying the land beneath his house, how dignity and respect had become my guiding stars. She listened intently, her eyes reflecting the gravity of my words without judgment or pity. "This is powerful," she said. "People need to hear this. You're not alone." When the article was published, I was both terrified and relieved. My story, once confined to whispered conversations and legal documents, was now out in the open. The reactions were mixed. Some neighbors expressed sympathy, others whispered behind closed doors. But I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: connection. Social media brought a flood of messages, some supportive, others critical. But what struck me most were the letters from strangers who had faced similar battles, who thanked me for speaking out. Their words were a reminder that my pain was shared and my courage could be a beacon. My son's response came swiftly, a terse phone call filled with accusations and veiled threats. But I was prepared. I had gathered evidence, documented interactions, and was no longer afraid to stand firm. One afternoon, as I sat at the kitchen table reviewing messages on my laptop, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Clara standing there with a warm smile and a folder of printed letters from readers. "We wanted to show you how much your story has touched people," she said. "You've started a conversation that needed to happen." Her presence was a quiet affirmation of the journey I had undertaken, a journey from silence to voice, from invisibility to power. Later that evening, I looked out at the garden where the late afternoon sun bathed the flowers in golden light. I thought about the path ahead, the challenges, the healing, and the hope. My story was no longer just mine. It was part of a larger tapestry of resilience and dignity. In sharing my truth, I had reclaimed not only my land but my place in the world. The air between us changed after my story went public. It was subtle at first, quiet phone calls, curt texts, and a few stilted visits, but slowly the tension crystallized into something undeniable, a shift in power that no one could ignore. My son came to the house one late afternoon, his face taut, eyes shadowed with unease. He didn't say hello or sit down. Instead, he stood by the window, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, as if bracing against a storm. "I want to talk," he finally said, his voice low and strained. I gestured toward the kitchen table, where I had set 2 cups of tea. He sank into a chair, still avoiding eye contact. "This isn't just about the land," he began. "It's about us, our family, the way things have changed." I nodded slowly. "It is about us, and about respect." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want it to come to this. I thought we could handle things quietly. But you made it public, and that's hard." I took a sip of my tea, steady and calm. I had no choice. Being silent wasn't working. I needed to be heard. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen in months: regret. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never wanted to push you away. I just didn't know how to handle the change." "I understand," I replied, "but I needed you to understand me too." Our conversation stretched into the evening, a cautious attempt to bridge the chasm that had grown between us. We talked about memories, misunderstandings, and the hopes we still held for the family. Over the next weeks, the atmosphere lightened slightly. The visits became more frequent, the phone calls warmer, yet the ownership of the land beneath the house had changed the rules. My son was no longer the sole master of the domain. When I went to check on the property, I noticed subtle signs of respect. The fence gate was unlocked when I arrived, my chair by the window was restored to its place, and my favorite flowers were blooming brighter in the garden. One afternoon, I found him kneeling beside the tulips, his hands gently tending the soil. He looked up and smiled. A small, genuine smile. "I want to make this work," he said. I nodded, a sense of cautious hope blossoming in my chest. But the road ahead was still uncertain. Trust, once fractured, takes time to mend, and while the power dynamic had shifted, healing required more than legal deeds and public statements. That night, I sat alone with my thoughts, feeling the quiet strength of survival and the fragile promise of reconciliation. I knew I had reclaimed more than land. I had reclaimed my place in a family that was learning to see me anew. The weeks that followed the tentative reconciliation were a slow unraveling of old wounds, a delicate weaving of new patterns into the fabric of our fractured family. I found myself learning how to breathe again, not just physically, but emotionally, allowing space for pain, forgiveness, and hope to coexist. One morning, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the sun climb higher and spill warm light over the garden. The tulips my son tended were now in full bloom, their bright petals a reminder of growth amid hardship. I traced the delicate veins of a leaf with a gentle finger, feeling a deep sense of calm I hadn't known in months. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the nights of loneliness, the moments of defiance, the quiet strength it took to stand firm when the world tried to push me aside. In the mirror, I saw the woman who had weathered storms not by running from them, but by facing them head-on. I realized that my worth was not tethered to anyone else's approval. It was rooted in the life I had lived, the love I had given, and the dignity I chose to claim. The kitchen filled with the scent of fresh bread as I prepared a simple lunch. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, and I opened it to find my granddaughter standing there, shy but smiling. "Grandma," she said softly, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from the roadside. Her gesture touched me deeply. It was a sign that despite the past distance, seeds of connection were sprouting anew. We spent the afternoon together, sharing stories and laughter, the kind of warmth that only family can bring. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully present, seen, loved, and at peace. That evening, as twilight softened the sky, I sat alone in my favorite chair by the window. The garden outside was a tapestry of shadows and light, much like the emotions that had carried me here. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a quiet smile. This was not the end of the story, but a new beginning, one written with courage, grace, and the unwavering belief in my own worth. No matter what came next, I knew I had reclaimed more than land or title. I had reclaimed my voice, my spirit, and my place in the world. The morning light spilled gently through the curtains, casting soft golden hues across the worn wooden floorboards of my small, newly rented apartment. The air smelled faintly of fresh linen and coffee brewing in the kitchen, simple comforts that reminded me, with quiet insistence, that life continued beyond the fractured walls of the family home I once knew. This was my new beginning, forged in the aftermath of struggle, defiance, and ultimately, reclamation. I stood by the window, my silver hair tightly pulled back into a neat bun, the large gold hoop earrings catching the light as they swayed softly. The pale blue cardigan draped over my shoulders felt like a gentle armor, one I had earned through countless moments of resilience. My olive-toned skin, marked with delicate wrinkles, reflected years of endurance, silent strength, and now newfound peace. As I looked out, the city stirred awake below a tapestry of familiar sounds and movements, children heading to school, neighbors greeting one another, and the soft hum of life pressing forward. The world was the same, yet entirely different for me now. I wasn't just an observer on the sidelines anymore. I was an active participant, shaping my path with quiet but deliberate steps. The apartment was modest but inviting. I had spent the past few weeks unpacking the few treasured belongings I had chosen to bring with me: photos of my grandchildren, the faded quilt I had sewn decades ago, and a small collection of books that had always offered solace. Each object held a story, a piece of my identity that no one could take away. I settled into my favorite chair, the one positioned by the window, and allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. The journey here had been painful, marked by rejection, legal battles, and long nights filled with uncertainty. Yet, every setback had carved away the doubts, revealing a core of determination I hadn't known I possessed. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Clara, the editor from the local newsletter who had first helped me share my story. "Good morning," she said warmly. "I wanted to tell you about an event we're hosting next week, a community gathering focused on elder rights and empowerment. We'd be honored if you'd speak." Her invitation stirred a flicker of excitement in me. Speaking publicly had once seemed impossible, but now it felt like an extension of the voice I had reclaimed. "I'd like that," I replied softly. After the call, I took a deep breath and rose to prepare a simple breakfast. The routine, the everyday tasks, they grounded me, reminding me that life was not just about battles fought, but also about moments lived. As I sat with my cup of tea, I thought about my son, the man he had become, the pain between us, and the fragile steps we were beginning to take toward understanding. I held no illusions that the past would simply vanish, but hope had taken root where despair once lingered. Later that day, I ventured out into the neighborhood, carrying a small tote bag filled with homemade cookies and a handwritten note. I was visiting a community center where many seniors gathered, a place where I had found laughter, friendship, and a renewed sense of belonging. The smiles I received in return warmed me, a reminder that family could extend beyond bloodlines. Here, I was seen, valued, and embraced for who I was. In the evening, as twilight softened the sky, I returned home and opened my notebook, the one where I had chronicled my journey. I wrote not just of challenges, but of lessons learned and the quiet victories that marked my path. Closing the book, I looked out once more at the city lights twinkling like distant stars. The road ahead remained uncertain, but I no longer faced it alone or in silence. I was a woman who had fought for her place, who had reclaimed her story, and who now stepped boldly into a future defined on her own terms. The gentle rhythm of the keyboard beneath my fingers felt like a heartbeat, steady and sure, as I typed the words I hoped would resonate far beyond my own story. Writing had become my refuge and my weapon, an unyielding assertion that even when cast aside, a voice can rise, clear and unwavering. I knew that this final message wasn't just for me, it was for anyone who had ever felt invisible, unheard, or discarded. I paused, gazing out the window at the late afternoon sky, painted in soft shades of lavender and gold. The world outside moved on, oblivious to my struggles and triumphs, but I felt connected to something larger, a shared humanity woven through stories like mine, stories of strength born from pain. The letter I was composing was to the community that had embraced me when family had faltered. It was a call to courage, a reminder that dignity is never given freely, it is claimed with steadfast heart and resolute will. I wrote about the power in standing firm, the grace in choosing one's own path, and the unbreakable spirit that lives in all of us. As I typed, memories surfaced, nights spent staring at the ceiling, the ache of rejection, the quiet moments of rebellion when I refused to vanish quietly. I thought of my son, the fractured bonds, and the fragile hope that someday understanding might grow where hurt had taken root. The story was no longer just about land or family. It was about identity, about reclaiming space in a world too eager to erase those who don't fit neatly into its plans. Finishing the letter, I read it aloud softly, my voice steady and clear. I signed my name, a simple mark that carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of courage. I saved the document and prepared it for publication, knowing that once it went out, there was no turning back, but I was ready. Later that evening, I sat in my favorite chair, the glow of the computer screen casting gentle light across my face. My silver hair was neatly pulled back into a bun, the large gold hoop earrings catching the light with every slight movement. The soft navy cardigan wrapped around me like a shield, a reminder of how far I had come. I looked around the modest apartment that had become my sanctuary, the worn wooden floor, the small bookshelf lined with treasured volumes, the vase of freshly picked wildflowers on the table. Each element told a story of resilience, renewal, and quiet victory. The phone rang softly, and I answered to hear a voice full of warmth and gratitude. It was Clara, the editor who had first given me the chance to share my story. "Your letter has touched so many," she said. "You've given strength to people who thought they were alone." I smiled, a soft, satisfied curve of my lips. "We are never truly alone," I replied, "and sometimes the hardest battles bring the brightest light." As I hung up, a profound peace settled over me. This journey marked by pain, defiance, and eventual empowerment had led me here, to a place where my voice mattered. No longer just a mother fighting for recognition, I was a woman who had reclaimed her dignity and found her place on her own terms. The future was uncertain, but I faced it with open eyes and an unyielding spirit. And in that, I was truly free.